Good evening, and thank you for joining me for another Boring Books for Bedtime. I hope tonight's selection provides all the boredom your busy brain needs to quiet down and let you get some sleep. Before we begin, I'd like to give a special shout out of thanks to two new members of our Patreon family, Brenda and Sarah. Thank you both so much for supporting this podcast. By becoming members of Patreon, you help us remain 100% listener supported and ad-free for everyone, and it's very much appreciated. If you're interested in supporting Boring Books for Bedtime and finding out more about the perks available to subscribers, including exclusive episodes heard nowhere else, you'll find a link to Patreon in the show description. You'll also find a link to buymeacoffee.com, where you can support us with a one-time tip, no subscription required. I hope you'll take a moment to check them out. Now, let's read and relax. Find a comfortable spot. Adjust your volume. Take a nice deep breath in. Let it out slowly. And off we go. Tonight we're returning to a work I was stunned to see I haven't read from in 3 years. Time does fly by, doesn't it? Let's relax with more from The Ethics by Aristotle, from a translation by D.P. Chase, with introduction by J.A. Smith, first published in 1911 by J.M. Denton Sons, London. Let's pick up right where we left off, towards the end of the introduction to the different books of the Ethics by J.A. Smith. Let's begin. At the beginning of Book 10, we return to the topic of pleasure, which is now regarded from a different point of view. In Book 7, the antagonists were those who overemphasized the irrationality or badness of pleasure. Here it is rather those who so exaggerate its value as to confuse or identify it with the good or happiness. But there is offered us in this section much more than criticism of the errors of others. Answers are given both to the psychological question, what is pleasure, and to the ethical question, what is its value? Pleasure, we are told, is the natural concomitant and index of perfect activity, distinguishable but inseparable from it, the activity of a subject at its best, acting upon an object at its best. It is therefore always and in itself a good, but its value rises and falls with that of the activity with which it is conjoined, and which it intensifies and perfects. Hence it follows that the highest and best pleasures are those which accompany the highest and best activity. Pleasure is, therefore, a necessary element in the best life, but it is not the whole of it, nor the principal ingredient. The value of a life depends upon the nature and worth of the activity which it involves. Given the maximum of full free action, the maximum of pleasure necessary follows. But on what sort of life is such activity possible? This leads us back to the next question. What is happiness? In what life can man find the fullest satisfaction for his desires? To this question, Aristotle gives an answer which cannot but surprise us after what has preceded. True happiness, great satisfaction, cannot be found by man in any form of practical life. No, not in the fullest and freest exercise possible of the moral virtues, not in the life of the citizen or of the great soldier or statesman. To seek it there is to court failure and disappointment. it is to be found in the life of the onlooker, the disinterested spectator, or to put it more distinctly, in the life of the philosopher, the life of scientific and philosophic contemplation. The highest and most satisfying form of life possible to man is the contemplative life. It is only in a secondary sense, and for those incapable of their life, that the practical or moral idea is the best. It is time that such a life is not distinctively human, but it is the privilege of man to partake in it, and such participation, at however rare intervals or for however short a period, is the highest happiness which human life can offer. All other activities have value only because and insofar as they render this life possible. But it must not be forgotten that Aristotle conceives of this life as one of intense activity or energizing. It is just this which gives it its supremacy. In spite of the almost religious fervor with which he speaks of it, the most orthodox of his disciples paraphrases his meaning by describing its content as the service and vision of God. It is clear that he identified it with the life of the philosopher as he understood it, a life of ceaseless intellectual activity in which, at least at times, all the distractions and disturbances inseparable from practical life seem to disappear and become as nothing. This ideal was partly an inheritance from the more ardent idealism of his master Plato, but partly it was the expression of personal experience. The nobility of this ideal cannot be questioned. The conception of the end of man, or a life lived for truth, of a life blissfully absorbed in the vision of truth, is a lofty and inspiring one, but we cannot resist certain criticisms upon its presentation by Aristotle. 1. The relation of it to the lower ideal of practice is left somewhat obscure. 2. It is described in such a way as renders its realization possible only to a gifted few and under exceptional circumstances. 3. It seems in various ways, as regards its content, to be unnecessarily and unjustifiably limited. But it must be borne in mind that this is a first endeavor to determine its principle, and that similar failures have attended the attempts to describe the religious or the spiritual ideals of life, which have continually been suggested by the apparently inherent limitations of the practical or moral life, which is the subject of moral philosophy. The moral ideal, to those who have most deeply reflected on it, leads to the thought of an ideal beyond and above it, which alone gives it meaning, but which seems to escape from definite conception by man. The richness and variety of this ideal ceaselessly invite, but as ceaselessly defy, our attempts to imprison it in a definite formula or portray it in detailed imagination. Yet the thought of it is and remains inexpugnable from our minds. This conception of the best life is not forgotten in the politics. The end of life in the state is itself well-living and well-doing, a life which helps to produce the best life. The great agency in the production of such life is the state operating through law, which is reason backed by force. For its greatest efficiency, there is required the development of a science of legislation. The main drift of what he says here is that the most desirable thing would be that the best reason of the community should be embodied in its laws. But so far as that is not possible, it still is true that anyone who would make himself and others better must become a miniature legislator, must study the general principles of law, morality, and education. The conception of politics with which he opened the ethics would serve as a guide to a father educating his children, as well as to the legislator legislating for the state. Finding in his predecessors no developed doctrine on this subject, Aristotle proposes himself to undertake the construction of it, and sketches in advance the program of the politics in the concluding sentence of the Ethics. His ultimate object is to answer the questions: what is the best form of polity? How should each be constituted? And what laws and customs should it adopt and employ? Not till the answer is given will the philosophy of human affairs be complete. On looking back, it will be seen that the discussion of the central topic of the nature and formation of character has expanded into a philosophy of human conduct, merging at its beginning and end into metaphysics. The result is a moral philosophy set against a background of political theory and general philosophy. The most characteristic features of this moral philosophy are due to the fact of its essentially teleological view of human life and action. 1. Every human activity, but especially every human practical activity, is directed towards a simple end discoverable by reflection, and this end is conceived of as the object of universal human desire, as something to be enjoyed, not as something which ought to be done or enacted. Aristotle's moral philosophy is not hedonistic, but it is eudaimonistic. The end is the enjoyment of happiness, not the fulfillment of duty. 2. Every human practical activity derives its value from its efficiency as a means to that end. It is good or bad, right or wrong, as it conduces or fails to conduce to happiness. Thus, his moral philosophy is essentially utilitarian or prudential. Right action presupposes thought or thinking, partly on the development of a clearer and distincter conception of the end of desire, partly as the deduction from that of rules which state the normally effective conditions of its realization. The thinking involved in right conduct is calculation, calculation of means to an end fixed by nature and foreknowable. Action itself is at its best just the realization of a scheme, preconceived and thought out beforehand, commending itself by its inherent attractiveness or promise of enjoyment. This view has the great advantage of exhibiting morality as essentially reasonable, but the accompanying disadvantage of lowering it into a somewhat prosaic and unideal prudentialism, nor is it saved from this by the tacking onto it by a sort of afterthought of the second and higher ideal, an addition which ruins the coherence of the account without really transmuting its substance. The source of our dissatisfaction with the whole theory lies deeper than in its tendency to identify the end with the maximum of enjoyment or satisfaction, or to regard the goodness or badness of acts and feelings as lying solely in their efficacy to produce such a result. It arises from the application to morality of the distinction of means and end. For this distinction, for all its plausibility and usefulness in ordinary thought and speech, cannot finally be maintained. In morality, and this is vital to its character, everything is both means and end, and so neither in distinction or separation. And all thinking about it which presupposes the finality of this distinction wanders into misconception and error. The thinking which really matters in conduct is not a thinking which imaginatively forecasts ideals, which promise to fulfill desire, or calculates means to their attainment. That is sometimes useful, sometimes harmful, and always subordinate, but thinking which reveals to the agent the situation in which he is to act, both, that is, the universal situation on which as man he always and everywhere stands, and the ever-varying and ever-novel situation in which he as this individual, here and now, finds himself. In such knowledge of given or historic fact lie the natural determinants of his conduct. In such knowledge alone lies the condition of his freedom and his good. But this does not mean that moral philosophy has not still much to learn from Aristotle's ethics. The work still remains one of the best introductions to a study of its important subject matter. It spreads before us a view of the relevant facts. It reduces them to manageable compass and order. It raises some of the central problems and makes acute and valuable suggestions towards their solution. Above all, it perpetually incites to renewed and independent reflection upon them. J. A. Smith. Aristotle's Ethics, Book 1. Every art and every science reduced to a teachable form, and in like manner every action and moral choice aims, it is thought, at some good, for which reason a common and by no means a bad description of the chief good is that which all things aim at. Now there plainly is a difference in the ends proposed, for in some cases they are acts of working, and in others certain works or tangible results beyond and beside the acts of working. And where there are certain ends beyond and beside the actions, the works are in their nature better than the acts of working. Again, since actions and arts and sciences are many, the ends likewise come to be many. Of the healing art, for instance, health; of the shipbuilding art, a vessel; of the military art, victory; and of domestic management, wealth, are respectively the ends. And whatever of such actions, arts, or sciences range under some one faculty, as under that of horsemanship the art of making bridles, and all that are connected with the manufacture of horse furniture in general, this itself again, and every action connected with war under the military art, and in the same way others under others, in all such the ends of the master arts are more choice-worthy than those ranging under them, because it is with a view to the former that the latter are pursued. And in this comparison it makes no difference whether the acts of working are themselves the ends of the actions, or something further beside them, as is the case in the arts and sciences we have been just speaking of. Since then of all things which may be done, there is some one end which we desire for its own sake, and with a view to which we desire everything else, and since we do not choose in all instances with a further end in view, for then men would go on without limit, and so the desire would be unsatisfied and fruitless. This plainly must be the chief good, that is, the best thing of all. Surely, then, even with reference to actual life and conduct, the knowledge of it must have great weight. And like archers, with a mark in view, we shall be more likely to hit upon what is right. And if so, we ought to try to describe, in outline at least, what it is and of which of the sciences and faculties it is the end. Now one would naturally suppose it to be the end of that which is most commanding and most inclusive, and to this description politics plainly answers, for this it is that determines which of the sciences should be in the communities, and which kind individuals are to learn, and what degree of proficiency is to be required. Again, we see also ranging under this the most highly esteemed faculties, such as the art military, and that of domestic management, and rhetoric. Well then, since this uses all the other practical sciences, and moreover lays down rules as to what men are to do and from what to abstain, the end of this must include the ends of the rest, and so must be the good of man. And grant that this is the same to the individual and to the community, yet surely that of the latter is plainly greater and more perfect to discover and preserve. For to do this even for a single individual were a matter of contentment, but to do it for a whole nation and for communities generally were more noble and godlike. Such then are the objects proposed by our treatise, which is of the nature of politics, and I conceive I shall have spoken on them satisfactorily, if they be made as distinctly clear as the nature of the subject matter will admit. For exactness must not be looked for in all discussions alike, any more than in all works of handicraft. Now the notions of nobleness and justice, with the examination of which politics is concerned, admit of variation and error to such a degree that they are supposed by some to exist conventionally only, and not in the nature of things. But then again, the things which are allowed to be goods admit of a similar error, because harm comes to many from them. For before now, some have perished through wealth, and others through valor. We must be content then in speaking of such things and from such data, to set forth the truth roughly and in outline, and in other words, since we are speaking of general matter and from general data, to draw also conclusions merely general. And in the same spirit should each person receive what we say. For the man of education will seek exactness so far in each subject as the nature of the thing admits, it being plainly much the same absurdity to put up with a mathematician who tries to persuade instead of proving, and to demand strict demonstrative reasoning of a rhetorician. Now each man judges well what he knows, and of these things he is a good judge. On each particular matter, then, he is a good judge who has been instructed in it, and in a general way, the man of general mental cultivation. Hence the young man is not a fit student of moral philosophy, for he has no experience in the actions of life, while all that is said presupposes and is concerned with these. And in the next place, since he is apt to follow the impulses of his passions, he will hear as though he heard not, and to no profit. the end in view being practice and not mere knowledge. And I draw no distinction between young in years and youthful in temper and disposition, the defect to which I allude being no direct result of the time, but of living at the beck and call of passion, and following each object as it rises. For to them that are such, the knowledge comes to be unprofitable, as to those of imperfect self-control. But to those who form their desires and act in accordance with reason, to have knowledge on these points must be very profitable. Let thus much suffice by way of preface on these 3 points: the student, the spirit in which our observation should be received, and the object which we propose. And now, resuming the statement with which we commenced, since all knowledge and moral choice grasps at good of some kind or another, what good is that which we say politics aims at? Or, in other words, what is the highest of all the goods which are the objects of action? So far as name goes, there is a pretty general agreement. For happiness, both the multitude and the refined few call it, and living well and doing well they conceive to be the same with being happy. But about the nature of this happiness men dispute, and the multitude do not in their account of it agree with the wise. For some say it is some one of those things which are palpable and apparent, as pleasure or wealth or honor. In fact, some one thing, some another. Nay, oftentimes the same man gives a different account of it. For when ill, he calls it health, when poor, wealth, and conscious of their own ignorance, men admire those who talk grandly and above their comprehension. Some again held it to be something by itself, other than and beside these many good things, which is in fact to all these the cause of their being good. Now to sift all the opinions would be perhaps rather a fruitless task, so it shall suffice to sift those which are most generally current, or are thought to have some reason in them. And here we must not forget the difference between reasoning from principles and reasoning to principles. For with good cause did Plato too doubt about this, and inquire whether the right road is from principles or to principles, just as in the race course from the judges to the further end, or vice versa. Of course we must begin with what is known, but then this is of 2 kinds, what we do know and what we may know. Perhaps then as individuals we must begin with what we do know. Hence the necessity that he should have been well trained in habits who is to study, with any tolerable chance of profit, the principles of nobleness and justice and moral philosophy generally. For a principle is a matter of fact, and if the fact is sufficiently clear to a man, there will be no need in addition of the reason for the fact, and he that has been thus trained either has principles already or can receive them easily. As for him who neither has nor can receive them, let him hear his sentence from Hesiod. He is best of all, who of himself conceiveth all things. Good again is he too who can adopt a good suggestion, but whoso neither of himself conceiveth, nor hearing from another, layeth it to heart, he is a useless man. But to return from this digression. Now of the chief good, that is of happiness, men seem to form their notions from the different modes of life, as we might naturally expect. The many and most low conceive it to be pleasure, and hence they are content with the life of sensual enjoyment. For there are three lines of life which stand out prominently to view: that just mentioned, and the life in society, and thirdly, the life of contemplation. Now the many are plainly quite slavish, choosing a life like that of brute animals, yet they obtain some consideration because many of the great share the tastes of Sardanapalus. The refined and active again conceive it to be honor, for this may be said to be the end of the life in society. Yet it is plainly too superficial for the object of our search, because it is thought to rest with those who pay rather than with him who receives it, whereas the chief good we feel instinctively must be something which is our own and not easily to be taken from us. And besides, men seem to pursue honor that they may believe themselves to be good. For instance, they seek to be honored by the wise and by those among whom they are known, and for virtue. Clearly then, in the opinion at least of these men, virtue is higher than honor. In truth, one would be much more inclined to think this to be the end of the life in society. Yet this itself is plainly not sufficiently final, for it is conceived possible that a man possessed of virtue might sleep or be inactive all through his life, or as a third case, suffer the greatest evils and misfortunes. And the man who should live thus no one would call happy, except for mere disputation's sake. And for these, let thus much suffice, for they have been treated of at sufficient length in my encyclia. A third line of life is that of contemplation, concerning which we shall make our examination in the sequel. As for the life of money-making, it is one of constraint, and wealth manifestly is not the good we are seeking, because it is for use, that is, for the sake of something further, and hence one would rather conceive the forementioned ends to be the right ones, for men rest content with them for their own sakes. Yet clearly they are not the objects of our search either, though many words have been wasted on them. So much then for these. Again, the notion of one universal good, the same that is in all things, it is better perhaps we should examine and discuss the meaning of it, though such an inquiry is unpleasant, because they are friends of ours who have introduced these. Still perhaps it may appear better, nay, to be our duty where the safety of the truth is concerned, to upset, if need be, even our own theories, especially as we are lovers of wisdom. For since both are dear to us, we are bound to prefer the truth. Now they who invented this doctrine of ideas did not apply it to those things in which they spoke of priority and posteriority, and so they never made any idea of numbers. But good is predicated in the categories of substance, quality, and relation. Now that which exists of itself, that is, substance, is prior in the nature of things to that which is relative, because this latter is an offshoot, as it were, and result of that which is. On their own principle, then, there cannot be a common idea in the case of these. In the next place, since God is predicated in as many ways as there are modes of existence, for it is predicated in the category of substance, as God intellect, and in that of quality as the virtues, and in that of quantity as the mean, and in that of relation as the useful, and in that of time as opportunity, and in that of place as abode, and other such like things, it manifestly cannot be something common and universal and one in all, else it would not have been predicated in all the categories, but in one only. Thirdly, since those things which range under one idea are also under the cognizance of one science, there would have been, on their theory, only one science taking cognizance of all goods collectively. But in fact there are many even for those which range under one category. For instance, of opportunity or seasonableness, which I have before mentioned as being in the category of time. The science is in war generalship, in disease medical science, and of the mean, which I quoted before as being in the category of quantity, in food the medical science, and in labor or exercise the gymnastic science. A person might fairly doubt also what in the world they mean by every this or that or the other, since, as they would themselves allow, the account of the humanity is one and the same in the everyman and in any individual man. For so far as the individual and the everyman are both man, they will not differ at all, and if so, then very good and any particular good will not differ in so far as both are good. Nor will it do to say that the eternity of the very good makes it to be more good, for what has lasted white ever so long is no whiter than what lasts but for a day. No, the Pythagoreans do seem to give a more credible account of the matter, who place one among the goods in their double list of goods and bads, which philosophers in fact Speusippus seems to have followed. But of these matters let us speak at some other time. Now there is plainly a loophole to object to what has been advanced, on the plea that the theory I have attacked is not by its advocates applied to all good, but those goods only are spoken of as being under one idea which are pursued, and with which men rest content simply for their own sakes, whereas those things which have a tendency to produce or preserve them in any way, or to hinder their contraries, are called good because of these other goods, and after another fashion. It is manifest then that the goods may be so called in two senses, the one class for their own sakes, the other because of these. Very well then, let us separate the independent goods from the instrumental, and see whether they are spoken of as under one idea. But the question next arises, what kind of goods are we to call independent? All such as are pursued, even when separated from other goods, as for instance being wise, seeing, and certain pleasures and honors, for these, though we do pursue them with some further end in view, one would still place among the independent goods. Or does it come in fact to this, that we can call nothing independent good except the idea, and so the concrete of it will be naught? If, on the other hand, these are independent goods, then we shall require that the account of the goodness be the same clearly in all, just as that of the whiteness is in snow and white lead. But how stands the fact? why of honor and wisdom and pleasure the accounts are distinct and different in so far as they are good. The chief good, then, is not something common and after one idea. But then, how does the name come to be common? For it is not seemingly a case of fortuitous equivocation. Are different individual things called good by virtue of being from one source, or all conducing to one end, or rather by way of analogy? For that intellect is to the soul as sight to the body, and so on. However, perhaps we ought to leave these questions now, for an accurate investigation of them is more properly the business of a different philosophy, and likewise respecting the idea, for even if there is some one good, predicated in common of all things that are good, or separable and capable of existing independently, manifestly it cannot be the object of human action or attainable by man. But we are in search now of something that is so. It may readily occur to anyone that it would be better to attain a knowledge of it with a view to such concrete goods as are attainable and practical, because, with this as a kind of model in our hands, we shall the better know what things are good for us individually, and when we know them, we shall attain them. Some plausibility, it is true, this argument possesses, but it is contradicted by the facts of the arts and sciences. For all these, though aiming at some good, and seeking that which is deficient, yet predetermine the knowledge of it. Now it is not exactly probable that all artisans without exception should be ignorant of so great a help as this would be, and not even look after it. Neither is it easy to see wherein a weaver or a carpenter will be profited in respect of his craft by knowing the very good, or how a man will be the more apt to effect cures, or to command an army for having seen the idea itself. For manifestly it is not health after this general and abstract fashion which is the subject of the physician's investigation, but the health of man, or rather perhaps of this or that man, for he has to heal individuals. Thus much on these points. And now let us revert to the good of which we are in search. What can it be? For manifestly it is different in different actions and arts. For it is different in the healing art and in the art military, and similarly in the rest. What then is the chief good in each? Is it not that for the sake of which the other things are done? And this in the healing art is health, and in the art military victory, and in that of house building a house, and in any other thing something else. In short, in every action and moral choice, the end, because in all cases men do everything else with a view to this, so that if there is some one end of all things which are and may be done, this must be the good proposed by doing, or if more than one, then these. Thus our discussion, after some traversing about, has come to the same point we reached before, and this we must try yet more to clear up. Now since the ends are plainly many, and of these we choose some with a view to others, wealth, for instance, musical instruments, and in general all instruments, it is clear that all are not final, but the chief good is manifestly something final. And so, if there is some one only which is final, this must be the object of our search. But if several, then the most final of them will be it. Now, that which is an object of pursuit in itself, we call more final than that which is so with a view to something else. That again which is never an object of choice with a view to something else than those which are so both in themselves and with a view to this ulterior object. And so by the term absolutely final, we denote that which is an object of choice always in itself, and never with a view to any other. And of this nature happiness is mostly thought to be, for this we choose always for its own sake, and never with a view to anything further, whereas honor, pleasure, intellect, in fact every excellence we choose for their own sakes. It is true, because we would choose each of these even if no result were to follow, but we choose them also with a view to happiness, conceiving that through their instrumentality we shall be happy. But no man chooses happiness with a view to them, nor in fact with a view to any other thing whatsoever. The same result is seen to follow also from the notion of self-sufficiency, a quality thought to belong to the final good. Now, by sufficient for self, we mean not a single individual living a solitary life, but for his parents also, and children and wife, and in general friends and countrymen. For man is by nature adapted to a social existence, but of these, of course, some limit must be fixed, for if one extends it to parents and descendants and friends' friends, there is no end to it. This point, however, must be left for future investigation. For the present we define that to be self-sufficient, which taken alone makes life choice-worthy, and to be in want of nothing. Now of such kind we think happiness to be, and further to be most choice-worthy of all things, not being reckoned with any other thing, for if it were so reckoned, it is plain we must then allow it, with the addition of ever so small a good, to be more choice-worthy than it was before, because what is put to it becomes an addition of so much more good, and of goods the greater is ever the more choice-worthy. So then, happiness is manifestly something final and self-sufficient, being the end of all things which are and may be done. But it may be, to call happiness the chief good is a mere truism, and what is wanted is some clearer account of its real nature. Now this object may be easily attained when we have discovered what is the work of man. For as in the case of flute player, statuary, or artisan of any kind, or more generally all who have any work or course of action, their chief good and excellence is thought to reside in their work. So it would seem to be with man, if there is any work belonging to him. Are we then to suppose that while carpenter and cobbler have certain works and courses of action, man as man has none, but is left by nature without a work? Or would not one rather hold that as eye, hand, and foot, and generally each of his members, has manifestly some special work, so too the whole man, as distinct from all of these, has some work of his own? What then can this be? Not mere life, because that plainly is shared with him even by vegetables, and we want what is peculiar to him. We must separate off, then, the life of mere nourishment and growth, and next will come the life of sensation. But this again manifestly is common to horses, oxen, and every animal. There remains then a kind of life of the rational nature apt to act, and of this nature there are two parts denominated rational, the one as being obedient to reason, the other as having and exerting it. Again, as this life is also spoken of in two ways, we must take that which is in the way of actual working, because this is thought to be most properly entitled to the name. If then the work of man is a working of the soul in accordance with reason, or at least not independently of reason, and we say that the work of any given subject, and of that subject good of its kind, are the same in kind, as for instance of a harp player and a good harp player, and so on in every case, adding to the work eminence in the way of excellence. I mean, the work of a harp player is to play the harp, and of a good harp player to play it well. If I say this is so, and we assume the work of man to be life of a certain kind, that is to say, a working of the soul and actions with reason, and of a good man to do these things well and nobly, and in fact everything is finished off well in the way of the excellence which peculiarly belongs to it. If all this is so, then the good of man comes to be a working of the soul in the way of excellence, or if excellence admits of degrees, in the way of the best and most perfect excellence. And we must add, in a complete life, for as it is not one swallow or one fine day that makes a spring, so it is not one day or a short time that makes a man blessed and happy. Let this then be taken for a rough sketch of the chief good, since it is probably the right way to give first the outline and fill it in afterwards. And it would seem that any man may improve and connect what is good in the sketch, and that time is a good discoverer and cooperator in such matters. It is thus, in fact, that all improvements in the various arts have been brought about, for any man may fill up a deficiency. You must remember also what has been already stated, and not seek for exactness in all matters alike, but in each according to the subject matter, and so far as properly belongs to the system. The carpenter and geometrician, for instance, inquire into the right line in different fashion, the former so far as he wants it for his work, the latter inquires into its nature and properties, because he is concerned with the truth. So then, should one do in other matters, that the incidental matters may not exceed the direct ones. And again, you must not demand the reason either in all things alike, because in some it is sufficient that the fact has been well demonstrated, which is the case with first principles, and the fact is the first step, that is, starting point or principle. And of these first principles some are obtained by induction, some by perception, some by a course of habituation, others in other different ways, and we must try to trace up each in their own nature, and take pains to secure their being well defined, because they have great influence on what follows. It is thought, I mean, that the starting point or principle is more than half the whole matter, and that many of the points of inquiry come simultaneously into view thereby. And at that end of a section of the Ethics of Aristotle, I think we'll also end this evening's reading, which is a bit of a shame, because after a very long and roundabout introduction, I feel like we were finally getting somewhere, but we'll leave that for another time. I hope you enjoyed that. If you'd like to read this classic work for yourself, as always, you'll find a link to a free ebook from Project Gutenberg in the show description. If you'd like to connect, suggest a boring book you'd like to hear read, or request more from one we've already started, you can drop me an email via our website, www.boringbookspod.com. It's always a pleasure to hear from you. Thank you so much for joining me for this evening's reading. Until our next boring book, good night.